Hey friends, this is Pastor Joe from Southwest Lutheran Church, and I've got a fun video for you today. I'm answering a question from a friend of mine. He sent me a YouTube clip, and the clip is of two guys talking. One is Joe Rogan, who's a pretty well-known podcaster, although I've never actually seen or heard his podcast before. And the other is Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is a scientist, a cosmologist, and kind of, he's one of those public educator sort of people. Back in my day, I'm a millennial. We had Bill Nye the Science Guy encouraging people to do science, Neil deGrasse Tyson is kind of like that. Think of him as kind of a public advocate for scientific pursuits and that sort of thing. So my friend sent me this video and asked me what do I think, because in it, Rogan and Tyson, they're talking about how Tyson has three kinds of truth that he sees in the world. And he says, I believe there's an objective truth, and then there's a thing called personal truth, and then a thing called political truth. And they unpack this a little bit. So what do I think about this? And by the way, we'll share a link to the video in the description, so feel free to check that out too. I always love context, so I went and I found the whole podcast episode because I got just the little clip, and it's from Joe Rogan podcast number 1159. And it's interesting, when I went looking for context, there really wasn't any. It's a long conversation. It's over 3 hours long between these two guys, and just in the middle, they're talking one moment about how microwave ovens work and how MRI machines work, and then Tyson just says, hey, and I've been thinking about this, and he shares his idea that there's three kinds of truth. And so the first that he shares is he says there's objective truth. And when Tyson talks about objective truth, he means stuff we can learn from science. And that's his example. And he says, you can run a scientific experiment. And then you can run that same scientific experiment on the other side of the world. You can go to a different country with a different, voltage at the wall outlet. You can even have people who maybe dislike your hypothesis and your conclusion from your experiment, but if they run the experiment in the same way, they should get the same answers. And so because scientific investigation is repeatable like that, and you can have different people do the same experiment and get the same answers, he says this makes scientific truths objective truths because they're accessible to everyone. Then he talks about personal truths, and this is where Tyson, he puts religious belief. And so he talks about how, you can say that Jesus Christ is Lord, or you can say that Muhammad is the final prophet that God has sent into the world, things like that. And he says these are personal truths because you can argue for it, you can try to persuade people of it, but you can't verify it and repeat it in the same way that scientific pursuits can do. And so he says because of this, they're personal truths. The third kind of truth that he talks about is political truth, which is kind of a pragmatic thing. He says, if you just say something over and over again, if you hear it over and over again, then eventually you start to believe it. It's true through repetition. Now, there's a couple things that I really appreciate about Tyson's approach here. The first is that he's trying to keep things simple. They talk a little bit about how philosophers can have long discussions about what is truth and how do we define it and how do we get to it. And he says, I'm just going to use the word in the ordinary way that we use the word truth, something that is true. Okay, he doesn't want to get into the weeds, and simplicity is a virtue very often. So that's good. The other thing that I appreciate about Tyson's approach here is he's really trying to respect people who see differently from him. And so specifically when he's talking about people with religious belief, he says, they're going to say, this is true. I know it in my bones. It's, it's very deep. It's part of me. It's absolutely true. And he says, I'm not going to try to take that word truth away from them because that's not an argument that's going to be a productive sort of argument, because it's true to them, he says. I'm going to focus on those first two kinds of truth, right? Objective truth, he says, and personal truth. And so I do respect what he's doing and trying to keep things simple on the one hand, and on the other hand, respecting people who disagree with him or see things differently, because he doesn't want to try to denigrate their beliefs and assign, religious belief a lesser importance than something like a scientific belief. So I really respect that. At the same time, I do disagree with them. And I don't think that dividing truth into objective and personal categories is a really helpful way of seeing things, because I think it's going to call some things that really are objective personal. And it's going to call some objective truths personal just because those truths aren't accessible through scientific investigation, which is really what he likes to do. So here's how I would divide it up. I would divide it up into what I would call natural and supernatural truth. And you'll notice as we do this, I'm already admitting there's supernatural things that are outside of the realm of, like I can call it sensory experience. And this is the thing about natural truth is anything that you can investigate with your senses, your sense of touch, your sense of smell, your sense of taste, your sense of sight, your sense of hearing. For example, gravity. I can jump, and then I can feel myself pulled toward the ground. I can feel the impact when I hit. And if I were to get on a rocket ship and travel out into deep space, I would experience and feel gravity differently. I've investigated it and learned lots of things about gravity through my own sensory experience, right? And that's a natural truth. And this is how scientific investigation always works. It's on the basis of sensory experience, what I can see, what I can touch. And really, when you think about it, all of the scientific instruments that we have, from the most simple, a microscope in your high school biology lab, to the most complicated and expensive, the James Webb Space Telescope or the Large Hadron Collider, things like this, they're really just tools to make more and more phenomena accessible to our senses. So a microscope helps me see things that normally are too small for me to see. The James Webb Space Telescope helps me see in wavelengths of light and electromagnetic radiation that normally aren't visible to my naked eye because it's not visible light. The Large Hadron Collider helps us to sense particles that normally are imperceptible to us through all of its detectors and things like that, right? And that's what scientific instruments do, and what scientific investigation is based on is my experience of touch and sight and hearing and smell and sometimes even taste, right? But the thing is, not all natural truths are objective. Most of the time it's pretty objective, pretty repeatable, because in general, our senses all perceive things in the same way. If it's too hot for me, it's too hot for you. If gravity pulls on me, gravity pulls on you, things like that. But at the same time, we've come to recognize that, for example, our perception of space and time and velocity is, in fact, relative. We perceive these things differently, and in certain situations, we have to take that relativity into account as we're trying to perceive things accurately in the world, right? So all natural truth is not necessarily objective, right? It can be relative or personal in the way that Tyson would use. Now, in the same way, supernatural truth is not necessarily personal. Supernatural truth is not accessible to our physical senses because it works on something that's outside of this physical world, right? It works on a more spiritual level or a cognitive or rational kind of level. And this is really the best way that we have to investigate supernatural truths, at least apart from something like divine revelation, which, as a pastor, I'm pretty comfortable with divine revelation. Tyson wouldn't be. But we would all be comfortable with using our reason, our minds, to kind of investigate supernatural things. And so, for example, if we think about people in different places and times in the world, we can understand that there is, for example, like an objective moral law out there in the world. People in every time and place seem to all agree that it's morally wrong to kill another human being in cold blood. Right? Murder is not good. This is an objective, moral, supernatural truth. And as far as we can tell, it seems to be an objective thing that's shared by people all around the world. But it's not accessible to our senses in the same way that scientific investigation is. So it's supernatural, but it's still objective in the same way, right? And so that's why I wouldn't divide things up by objective and personal, because that leaves some big categories kind of open. What about objective truths that are spiritual? And what about relative truths that are accessible to our senses and things like that, So That's where I disagree. Right? And so that's how I would put it. I would say there's natural truth, there's supernatural truth, and we need to have different tools to investigate the two. Scientific pursuits are a great way to investigate the natural world, but they are totally unsuited to investigating the supernatural world. Spiritual methods, right, are much more appropriate to investigating the supernatural truths of the world, but they tend to not work that well when we talk about natural truths and things like that. So we have to know what sort of tool we need to use, what sort of sense, what sort of faculty we have that will help us get to the truth in any particular situation. Now, I want to say, Tyson's concern here is he wants to say that when we talk about our life together, we need to be working on the basis of objective truth. And I would agree with him in that. Right? He wants us to be making our decisions together. When we talk about laws, when we talk about, all this stuff, he wants us to be making our decisions on the basis of something that we can all agree on. And I'd agree with him on that. I think that's a good idea to live in a pluralistic society. We need to pursue objectivity. We can't favor, different policies or proposals just because it lines up more closely with something that's highly subjective for me. Right? And all of our good arguments, right, for different laws and proposals, we don't always agree, but we're always trying to point towards something objective, right, when we make those arguments. So I agree with them there. I disagree that there's, that's a good way to divide up the idea of truth into personal and objective. I'd say there's really probably just one truth that is objective, and you're either seeing it rightly or seeing it wrongly, right? There is a lot subjective, and so we're always trying to figure out the truth a little better than we have now. So that's my thought. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your response. Feel free to leave those in the comments below. I'd love to have a conversation. Or if you have other questions, other things you'd like to share, send them my way, and I'd love to respond. So until next time, take care. God bless. Have a great day.